Hello, everybody. Good evening. On behalf of the Harvard Business School Club of New York, a very warm welcome to all of you on a beautiful day to our ranked choice voting event. I'm Barry Puritz. I'm an alum of HBS, and among several hats, I co lead the social enterprise programming team for the club. We have organized together tonight. Tonight, together with Reform Elections Now, an initiative started by local HBS alum that has quickly achieved prominent national attention. That's good. Our club is the largest HBS alumni organization in the world, well over 10,000 graduates in the New York area. And our mission is very clear. We strive to make a difference by engaging alumni, by impacting the community, by fostering leadership, and helping with lifelong learning. We do this by offering 100 content-rich events every year, and now, of course, they're all virtual, as is tonight. That brings me to tonight, and so I will now pass it along to my fellow alum, Mike Otten, Reform Elections Now founder, and Mike will take it from here. Mike?
Thank you, Barry, and good afternoon to the many civic-minded individuals who are attending this call on what may be the most interesting political transformation of the year. To give you a little background on Reform Elections Now, we started out as a group of mostly Harvard Business School alumni who were motivated by a 2017 report by business executive Catherine Gale and Harvard professor Michael Porter, who suggested that the current politics industry is a classic duopoly with negative impacts affecting not only representative government, but also American business competitiveness. They identified the election processes as a major part of the problem, disincenting constructive government action and causing indirectly the political polarization that has become a major concern for all of us. Our team has evolved into a larger nonpartisan association of business and law school alumni. We have been working to educate ourselves and others as to how to include civic engagement as part of our personal responsibilities. We hope that today's discussion of ranked choice voting will motivate you to be better citizens, taking seriously your role to participate in politics in ways that improve our government. Intelligent voting is very much central to today's event, but we also encourage you to contact us after today's call if you wish to participate directly in our activities. We do not fundraise. We only require your intellectual engagement with our work to improve our democracy through election reform. The high turnout for last year's election reflects both an interest and a concern for how our government functions, with many questioning the fairness of both the process and its results. We believe that ranked choice voting is one of the means to better and fairer government representation, in this case specifically in New York City. Please pencil into your calendar our next event, also at 5:30 p.m., but on March 24th. It will address redistricting and gerrymandering as the topic. And now we can move up to the substance of this evening's program, ranked choice voting in New York City. Peter Cyrus is our Reform Elections Now Director of Research. He has long been a source of insights for our team, having anticipated too many of the difficult moments of the 2020 election, including the potential for January's violent demonstration. Peter has published international business texts as well as novels, dealing particularly with political and business transformation in China. He was also the winner of Harvard Business School's Volunteer of the Year Award in 2019. Please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to input any questions for Peter and our distinguished panel, who will be introduced later by Barry, and will lead the discussion, and Herb Kaplan will lead the discussion after Peter's review. Peter hates long introductions, so I now will just turn the meeting over to him. Peter, take it away.
Well, I thought I was going to get a bigger introduction. That's very disappointing. I had hoped for a long a long, beautiful introduction, and that's what I got. Oh, well. Um, bear with me 1 second. Okay. To go back to page 1. Okay, so today we're going to talk about ranked choice voting in New York. Now, in ranked choice voting in New York in 2021, New York City will use RCV with instant runoffs in its primaries for mayor, city council, and other elected positions. Here's how it works. Voters will rank up to their top 5 candidates in order of preference, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After all ballots are received, the votes are tabulated. If one candidate surpasses 50% of the number 1 votes on the first ballot, that candidate wins. If no one receives a majority, there'll be an instant runoff. The candidate with the fewest number 1 votes will be eliminated. Voters who gave that candidate a number 1 will have their votes transferred to the candidate to whom they gave a number 2. This process will continue automatically with a candidate eliminated each round until there are 2 candidates remaining, and the candidate with the most votes wins. If voters have not utilized all their choices, or if all their choices have been eliminated, their votes will be exhausted. Okay, so now that you fully understand ranked choice voting, before we go any further, we're going to have an election. And I'm sorry for the spacing problem here. Since the Academy Awards also use ranked choice voting, we're going to vote on our favorite movie. As in New York City, you get 5 choices, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you have 10 movies here on the list: The Godfather, Wizard of Oz, E.T., Star Wars, etc. So what I'd like you to do is click on the link in your chat box. It's listed below, but go to your chat box, click on the link, and vote now. And we'll give you a minute to vote.
Peter, we have to sign in with our name, but
Yes, put in your name and your email, and that's just so people running the chat box can have a record. I mean, the poll can have a record. So while you're voting, I'm going to keep going with the presentation rather than taking up too much time, but just keep voting.
Peter, it's Liz. I might just advise you to change the view of your presentation.
Yep.
So that basically we're all seeing the presenter. I mean, yeah, your view, but we need to see the slideshow view.
Okay.
At the top, tiny button should be just use slideshow.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go to slideshow.
Great.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay.
There we go. Brilliant.
Now we're back on the slideshow. So ranked choice voting has many advantages. It eliminates spoilers, promotes cooperation, encourages lots of candidates to run, reduces negative campaigning, discourages polarization, eliminates costly runoff, and reduces the impact of big money. On the other hand, it's a little complicated to explain, especially the first time it's used in a jurisdiction, and can sometimes produce unexpected results. Ranked choice voting is used in Maine and now Alaska in a slightly different form in numerous cities such as San Francisco, Oakland, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and many others, in 5 southern states for military and overseas voting for runoff elections, and in 5 states for Democratic presidential primaries and caucuses, and lots of foreign countries. Before discussing ranked choice voting in New York, let's take a brief stroll through history and see how it came to be adopted. Back to the Future, I don't want you voting for that movie. It's not on the list. But ranked choice voting may seem like a new concept, but a version of it has been used before in New York City. Prior to 1936, Tammany Hall controlled New York government, and when Fiorello LaGuardia swept into office before he built his airport, he created a reform task force, and in 1936, it implemented a form of ranked choice voting called proportional representation, single transferable vote. Let's not get into what that means. But basically, the system led to the election of the first minority and female council members, as well as the election of lots of third-party candidates. And as you can see from the chart on the right, the percentage of minorities elected during this period was higher than it's been before or after. Now, according to the words of Carlos Ochoa and George Chung, ranked choice voting worked so well, it was repealed. Why was it repealed? Well, the system increased the number of minorities, women, and third parties. Democrats didn't like to have their control weakened, and the Republicans didn't like coming in behind the American Labor Party. So it fell victim to the power of the two parties. Now, after they got rid of ranked choice voting, New York went with a simple system of traditional primaries. The problem with the traditional primaries is that a lot of these primaries were won by very, very small percentages of votes. In 1969, Mario Procaccino, he actually had 32.8%, not 33, of the vote. And Robert Wagner, who had been a former mayor, was challenged on the right by Procaccino, on the left by Badillo and Mailer. And what's interesting is, left, center, and right all ended up with about the same percentage. And interestingly, in the final election, John Lindsay, who lost the Republican nomination, won the Liberal nomination, and the Liberal defeated both the Republican and the Democrat. So anytime you have an election where the Democrats lose and the Republicans lose, you figure some change is coming. So after these types of elections, they changed the system and created runoffs. Now, runoffs solved the problem of people getting elected with 30% of the vote, but they had their own set of problems. According to Common Cause, in multi-candidate elections, 30% of the primaries were won by candidates with less than 40% of the vote. And what you had here in these runoffs were really low turnouts, even for high-profile races. In 2013, you had 200,000 people turned out to vote for public advocate. That was half the turnout of the primary and a quarter the turnout of the final election. And the Times estimated it cost $13 million or $64.15 per vote. And in 1993, there was a big runoff for controller between Alan Hevesy, Liz Holtzman, and Herman Badillo. And the turnout was 27% of that of the final. And interestingly, Badillo ran in the Democratic, Republican, and Liberal primaries. So, what's the point if he's running every primary? Now, one of the problems that we've seen in mayoral elections in off years especially is very low turnout. Political Research Quarterly analyzed 340 mayoral elections in 144 cities and concluded that the average turnout was 25.8. And as you can see from where it says NY, New York is, well below the average. Now, this wasn't always the case. According to Comptroller Scott Stringer, the turnout in the 1950s in New York was over 90%. In the 1960s, it was over 80%. In the last decade, it's averaged actually under 25%. So voters feel alienated, don't think their vote matters, don't have candidates to whom they can relate, are confused by election rules, and aren't focused on these 3 rounds of voting now that we have had runoffs. So with low turnouts, 3 rounds of voting, voters adopted in the last election, RCV for primaries in New York. Okay, so that's how we came to have RCV. Let's just take a quick look at some RCV elections. Here's an example of a RCV election, which is just like a regular election. London Breed, it's the 2019 San Francisco mayoral election. London Breed was the incumbent. She was a candidate. She got 70.28% of the vote on the first ballot. Rankings didn't matter. She was over 50%. She won. But let's look at what happened a year earlier. After the incumbent died, Breed ran for mayor, and she led the first round with 37%. She looked like a shoo-in. But if you look all the way to round 8, Gene Kim and Mark Leno were very close to each other in number of votes. Kim was eliminated, and 44,000 of her 66,000 votes went to Leno, and Breed only got 13,000 of her votes. Now, 8,000 of her votes were exhausted. And Breed won by only 2,500 votes, with only 45.7% of the original votes because of the exhausted votes. Interestingly, if a few more Kim voters had included Leno as one of their choices, he could have won. So what this election shows us is it's important for voters to think strategically to ensure their votes are not wasted. Now we come to one of the most interesting elections, and we're really lucky to have on our panel Rebecca Kaplan today. In 2010, Don Parada, not the incumbent, Don Parada ran for mayor of Oakland, and he led the first round with 33.7%. He maintained his lead, as you can see, through the first 7 rounds. In the last round, however, when Rebecca was eliminated, most of her votes went to Jean Quan, who had been in second place. And so Jean Quan, who was in second place all the way through rounds 1 through 9, in round 10, jumped over Don Parada and was elected mayor. And what this shows is the key thing is not whether you lead in the first round, it's whether you lead in the last round. Now, besides electing a candidate with the broadest appeal, ranked choice voting eliminates spoilers. A spoiler occurs when a minor candidate siphons votes from the closest aligned major candidate, allowing the other candidate to win. And because politicians worry about spoilers, candidates with a different constituency are often discouraged from running in plurality elections. And ranked choice voting solves this problem. Consider how ranked choice voting would have impacted the results of the 2000 presidential election. Ralph Nader ran on the Green Party, advocating corporate and campaign reform. Most of his votes likely came from Al Gore supporters. Gore won the popular vote by a large margin. Bush won Florida by 537 votes, and hence the Electoral College. Nader received 97,500 votes in Florida. Had ranked choice voting been in effect, most Nader voters would have given Gore their number 2. Gore would have won Florida, and hence the election, and people wouldn't have been calling Nader a spoiler, and Gore would be president. So let's look at something real in action, which was ranked choice voting in Maine number 2 in 2018. As you can see, there were 4 candidates, a Republican, a Democrat, and 2 independents. And the independents wanted to run on issues like supporting local business and limiting healthcare costs. In the first round, the Republican was ahead. In the second round, after the independents were eliminated, the Democrat won. So this was an election that allowed independents to run, attract some votes, but not be spoilers. Because, as I say, the Republican won the first round, the Democrat won the second round. Just as an aside, in the first impeachment of Donald Trump, the Democrat, Jared Golden, was one of 2 Democrats to vote against the impeachment of Donald Trump. I can't say it was because of RCV, but if you're running in an election where you need to attract votes from the widest range of people, it will tend to make you less partisan. Now, as I said, ranked choice voting results in less negative campaigning because you have to attract votes from eliminated candidates. You can't afford to alienate your opponent. So as compared to plurality elections, candidates in ranked choice voting elections are usually less negative and less likely to criticize each other. And if you can see from the charts where we looked at elections in California in 2013, you can see that the campaigns were a lot less negative and the candidates criticized each other a lot less. Now, we are supposed to see a video right now. What I'm going to do is pass on the video short term because I'm had some technical issues and come back to it in a few minutes. So hold on to that thought. Now, ranked choice voting reduces negative campaigning. It also has much less polarization, and that pattern carries over into governing. Since winners are elected with the support of other candidates, they tend to govern with less polarization. Ranked choice voting also attracts more candidates. Candidates can focus on a specific issue or issues without fear of harming closely aligned competitors. Voters are exposed to a broader range of issues. Now, at the present time, there appear to be 33 candidates running for mayor of New York, although by this point there could be 39. I did this yesterday or the day before. In the last election with no incumbents, there were 9. And part of this can be attributed to ranked choice voting, opening the door for people to focus on issues of importance to them. Now, also, even though people have said that ranked choice voting works against minorities, the fact is this: San Francisco, under ranked choice voting, San Francisco elected its first Asian American and African American mayors. Minneapolis elected African American, transgender, Somali American, and Latina council members. St. Paul, which is 67% white, elected its first African American mayor. And the presence of many minority candidates has tended to increase the visibility of issues of importance to these groups. Now, there's one other thing. It sounds very small, but there are military and overseas voters. And frankly, if there's 3 weeks between the primary and the final election, there's not time to get them ballots and get the ballots back. So ranked choice voting solves this problem. Ranked choice voting also makes it more difficult for money to dominate. You know, for one, you got to figure who you're going to pick on, and in ranked choice voting, it's tougher to handicap, you know, who's going to be eliminated when. And also, money spent on negative ads can backfire, as a candidate or interest group attacking another candidate can lose the chance of attracting that candidate's votes in later rounds. Now, earlier, we talked about the 2010 Oakland mayor election. The East Bay Times reported, quote, "The deep-pocketed backers of Don Parada have recently fallen back on a time-honored campaign strategy, slinging the mud. The Coalition for a Safer California, a PAC from the State Prison Guards Union, supporting Parada, targeted Kwan and council member Rebecca Kaplan. Strategy backfired as many of Kaplan's voters supported Kwan in the final round." So this 2 things makes it difficult for big money to have an impact on RCV elections. So while RCV voting leads to the election of candidate with the broadest appeal, eliminates spoilers and costly runoffs, increases the number of candidates, and decreases negative campaigning and polarization, There are a few issues that need to be addressed: the learning curve, complexities of the ballot, exhausted votes, the Board of Election, and natural enemies. Now, in any system, there's a learning curve. When RCV was first introduced in Minneapolis, turnout hit an all-time high. Same in all-time low. Sorry, same in St. Paul. In both cases, it improved dramatically over time because New York could go through a learning curve. A decline in turnout in 2021 would not be a shock. Exhausted votes is also something that people are not experienced with. An exhausted vote, as I said, is when a person's choice is eliminated before the final winner is declared. In Minneapolis in 2017, almost 22% of the votes were exhausted. Now, the percentage of exhausted votes depends on the number of rounds of calculations, the number of candidates, and rankings. If you have more candidates, you could have more exhausted votes. If you have more choices, like in San Francisco, voters can rank all their choices. That should lead to less exhausted votes. In Minneapolis, they can rank 6. In St. Paul, they can rank 3. New York is 5. So into the New York Democratic primary with about 33 candidates, no clear front runner, 5 ranking choices, and little experience in RCV voting, we could have a high percentage of exhausted votes. But here's what you have to remember. The percentage of exhausted votes is going to be a lot less than the vote drop off when runoffs are involved. Because when runoffs are involved, the vote drop off has been 50% or more. So this means even with exhausted votes, more voters will have their votes count. Now, for people used to plurality voting, ranked choice voting is complex. People have to be educated in the technique of filling out their ballot. They also have to be taught the strategies of ranked choice voting. And there are 2 key essentials. First, use all your rankings. If you have a preferred candidate, give him or her the #1 ranking. Your other rankings will not be used as long as your preferred candidate remains in the race. Don't worry about your #2 defeating your #1. If your #1 is in the race, your vote will still go to that candidate. But if you don't use all your choices, your votes will be exhausted. Secondly, allocate at least half your rankings to candidates that have a chance of winning. Minor candidates are likely to be eliminated early. If you don't allocate rankings to some candidates that can win, you'll have no say in the final election. Now, this is a list over here of the 29 candidates who were at one point or another running in the Democratic presidential primary last year. I know that sounds like a lot, but the reason I'm showing you this list is you actually have more people running for mayor. So if you had ranked Biden, Harris, Sanders, or other leaders, your vote would likely count in every round. If you rank Gabbard, Williamson, or any of the lower ranked candidates, your vote would likely have been exhausted earlier. Here's the point. If you like Tulsi Gabbard or Tom Steyer or Mike Gravel or any of those people, fine. It doesn't matter if you rate them 1 and 2. What matters is how you rank the final 3 candidates. And if your final 2 candidates, let's just say, are Biden and Sanders, it makes a huge difference which of these candidates gets a higher rating. Even if those are just 4 and 5, it matters. Because if the last 2 candidates are Biden and Sanders, the one who gets the 4 is who your vote is going to. Now, also just a comment on the Board of Elections. Ranked choice voting is a little different from plurality elections because you can't start counting the votes until every vote has been received. Otherwise, remember, in the first round, you're going to eliminate the person with the least number of votes. But if you start counting and then all of a sudden, 2,000 votes come in from some precinct for one candidate, that candidate got eliminated. Well, nope, they weren't the last anymore. So, and if there's a problem with voting machines or absentee ballots, it can mean that that the votes can be a little delayed. And you're not going to see partial results. You have to wait till all the votes are in and the tabulation is completed. Given these complexities, we may have to wait longer than normal to learn the results of the election.
No, we won't.
Okay.
A lot of misinformation.
What?
Sorry.
Well, I said we may have to, because we don't know. What I'm saying is not that necessarily going to have to wait longer, but it is possible and sometimes happens. But I do understand your position as to why we won't have to wait longer. And I also will point out that ranked choice voting has three natural enemies. The parties tend not to like it because it's more difficult for parties to control. Money tends not to like ranked choice voting since it's more difficult for money to control. And defeated candidates may fight RCV because they've lost. Ranked choice voting losers are often highly critical of the system. But having enemies does not mean it has not worked effectively. It only means that politicians like to win. So the introduction of ranked choice voting in New York primaries will represent a great experiment in democracy. Advocates are going to have to teach voters how to handle the system. Candidates are going to have to learn to campaign positively instead of negatively. Voters are going to have to learn to think strategically about ranking candidates. Citizens are going to have to understand there may be a learning curve that could result in exhausted votes. And everyone is going to have to understand that results are going to be reported differently than they're used to. Since still ranked choice voting can offer New York an alternative to the broken systems that have been in effect for decades. Now, if
Just in the interest of time, Peter, if you can we jump ahead and maybe on the backside talk about the results of the poll? Will that
Yes.
work?
Yes.
So thanks. I mean, you've obviously given us a lot to think about. And I'm not sure I understand it 100%, but I know it better than I used to. We're going to move on now to a panel discussion with Amy Loprest, Rebecca Kaplan, Susan Lerner, in addition to you, Peter. You have the panelist bios from our event announcement. Just very briefly, Amy is the executive director of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. They're key to implementing ranked choice voting in New York. Rebecca is presently a council member at large and vice mayor in Oakland. Rebecca, as Peter mentioned, has rich experience with RCV. And Susan Lerner is the ED, executive director of Common Cause in New York. And Common Cause is very involved in promoting successful elections and our conversion to our ranked choice voting. So with that, let me turn it over to my fellow alum and yours, Herb Kaplan, no relation to Rebecca, who will moderate the panel discussion. Herb?
Thank you, Barry. I just want to say that I will be asking our panelists a broad range of questions on the subject of ranked choice voting, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. And before we begin, I would just like to say that this panel discussion is off the record. So let's begin. I would like to first ask each of the panelists a question, and then we'll open it up a little bit more. So I'll start with Amy. Amy, the Campaign Finance Board is responsible for educating voters on ranked choice voting. Can you briefly tell our audience what your organization is doing to prepare New Yorkers for the June primaries, and especially how you are reaching out to the elderly, to minorities, and those for whom English is not their first language?
Well, thank you, Herb. And I am very happy to be here to answer your questions. The Campaign Finance Board, when the charter referendum was passed in 2019, was tasked with the task of educating the voters about ranked choice voting, A lot of people have talked about, the timing of starting this. As you know, the past year has been unlike any year that anyone has seen. But we had made a conscious choice to start with the special elections, which the first one happened in the beginning of February, and there's been a second one in February, and then there'll be 2 more in the end of March to, start our training program to learn what works and doesn't work, using those special elections as a test case. But our plan for educating voters is 5 points. So first, we're working with a lot of community groups and organizations to do what we call train the trainers. And so knowing that messages about how to vote and what voting works and what doesn't work comes best from people that are trusted within your community, we understand that it's important, in particular to some of the populations you're talking about, the elderly, minorities, people who English is not their first language. It's very important for them to hear those messages from their own community leaders. So we have embarked from January through February, every 2 weeks, having what we call train the trainer sessions. And we've held 25 of them so far, with 427 attendees. And so the understanding is that those community organizations, the representatives, will go out and in their community meetings or in their daily interactions with their constituents, will take that information they learned in that training session and explain ranked choice voting to the people in their communities. The second way we're training voters is directly to voters. So we've been doing remote trainings for voters, and many of these trainings have been in conjunction with elected officials in various areas, focusing first on elected officials that were in for those Queen's special elections, and now moving towards working with elected officials in the Bronx for the 2 special elections that will happen in March. We've been working with the Bronx Borough's presidents. We work with assemblywomen, people in Queens. We have held 43 of those direct to voter interactions and have had over 2,400 people attend those presentations. We're very excited because in the end of March, we will be, I guess actually in the middle of March, on March 16th and March 18th, with the Bronx Borough President's Office and NALEO and Dominicanos USA, will be conducting direct-to-voter trainings in Spanish. So for people who are Spanish language speakers, those trainings will actually be conducted in Spanish. The third thing that we've been doing is we've been attending panels and events like this one, very much like this one. Our staff that are in our public affairs unit have been going out throughout the community, attending, like community boards, at political clubs, in business groups, attending panel discussions like this to educate people about ranked choice voting. Fourth, of course, we are seeking and have gotten a lot of earned media, both, a lot of newspaper articles about ranked choice voting, a lot of, educational materials that have been put out by, newspapers, and WMIC has done some programming about ranked choice voting. So we work with our press staff, works with the media outlets on those. And then finally, we are, unlike the direct to voter training, those big training sessions, we're doing direct to voter contacts. And so what I mean by that is, us reaching out to voters instead of them coming to our training, us reaching out to them. So that has included sending postcards to every household with a registered voter in all of the special election districts. We will be sending a postcard to every registered voter in New York City in advance of the primary. And we've also done some texting campaigns to educate people about ranked choice voting in the special elections. And that is part of our ordinary get out the vote activities. And finally, we have a large social media presence. And so our social media experts are off, doing Instagram videos, Facebook videos with youth, with different communities to train and to tell people about ranked choice voting.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to ask Susan the next question. In addition to educating voters on ranked choice voting, Common Cause is educating candidates on how they may adjust their campaign strategies in this ranked choice voting election format. Can you briefly describe or explain your education efforts, particularly your work with the candidates? Unmute yourself, Susan.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be part of this panel and this interesting discussion, and I want to compliment Peter for a fabulous history review. We have been working for the last year with candidates, because how you run your campaign in ranked choice voting is actually different, and it requires some adjustment. It requires the campaigns thinking differently. What we've learned in other jurisdictions that have introduced ranked choice voting, that a successful introduction of ranked choice voting really requires collaboration among three different groups. One, the city has got to really engage in a thorough education campaign, as Amy was just talking about. New York City is definitely on top of that aspect. The nonprofit and advocacy community has a role in helping to educate the community, particularly groups that are active in particular neighborhoods and particular communities. But the third part really is the candidates, because the candidates are talking to voters on a regular basis and they're in direct contact. So if they're able to explain to the voter about ranked choice voting, they have an instant connection that is helpful to the candidate with the voter. So what we have developed is a training that is approximately 6 hours for candidates and for campaign staff. And what we do is we help them first understand how ranked choice voting works. We help them set the appropriate expectations in terms of the timing, what people will see on election night, which is exactly what we see now, and the fact that ranked choice voting does not speed up or slow down the counting itself. That's all controlled by state law and how it deals with the absentees. And we take them through exercises on how to talk about ranked choice voting, and we share with them examples of other jurisdictions' advertising and campaign literature to show how you can make coalitions and affiliations to join with other candidates. So as Peter said, what we've seen is that ranked choice voting definitely has a decrease. There's a disincentive to go negative with ranked choice voting. And there's actually an incentive to work jointly with candidates who share a similar ideological outlook. So that candidates, we have actually had sessions where a candidate has asked a question and said, there's somebody running in my district who has a very similar ideological background. Should I invite them to have coffee? Should we see if we can collaborate? And that was a Zoom call. And it turned out that the candidate she had in mind was on screen number 4. And so they immediately, as part of the briefing, decided to get together and see how they could collaborate. We are seeing candidates who are doing joint fundraisers, who are doing joint education events. So we really help candidates understand that, unlike a situation in a crowded field in the first past the post or the plurality race, where you're desperate to find some way to distinguish yourself from a candidate that's ideologically close to you and all too often fall into kind of a nasty, negative personal back and forth. Here, it's exactly the opposite. You want to emphasize your commonalities, not your differences. And the reason for that is because you want to be ranked. If you're not going to be the voter's number 1, you want to be their number 2 or 3. So it's not unusual to see campaign literature that says that comes from more than one candidate and endorsements that are of more than one candidate saying rank us 1 and 2, or our endorsement is candidate A as 1, candidate B as 2. And what's really salutary is in a plurality race, when you're door knocking or you're talking to voters on the phone, as we help our the candidates that we are training, when you ask the voter, who do you have a first choice? Would you support my candidate? And they say, you know, I really like the incumbent better, or I'm really excited about so-and-so. In a plurality race, that's the end of the conversation. Your campaign staff has been educated to hang up the phone or go on to the next house because there's nothing to be gained in continuing the conversation with somebody who has a clear preference for another candidate. Not so with ranked choice voting. And in fact, when you get the answer, well, you know, I'm really excited about this other candidate, it's the beginning of the conversation that you should have in ranked choice voting, where the question is, oh, that's really interesting. I'm really glad that you have, you know, thought about this. What about that other candidate is exciting to you? And the voter says, oh, you know, I really think their affordable housing campaign and their affordable housing position is really what we need. And I think it's really important that they be elected and that that approach to affordable housing is adopted. And what we train candidates and campaign people to say is, where it's appropriate, obviously, well, you know, have you looked at my candidate's affordable housing campaign? Because there are a lot of commonalities where candidate A says this, we say something very similar. And so I'd like to leave material with you about my candidate and their affordable housing position. And will you rank my candidate as your second or third choice? And that's the conversation that you want to be having, rather than just going on to the next voter and crossing that voter off. The candidates also need to reach out beyond their intuitive base. In a plurality first past the post race, what consultants will tell the candidate is, don't worry about that community on the other side of your district. They're never going to vote for you. Don't spend your time there. Spend your time and money with the people you know are going to vote for you, and let's work to turn them out and ignore everybody else. That is a prescription to be a loser in a ranked choice voting campaign. Because again, if you're not going to be the voter's number 1, you want to be their 2 or 3. And therefore, you've got to get out of your comfort zone. You've got to learn how to talk and listen to voters in other communities, voters who are not necessarily your intuitive base, and find a commonality with them. And what we've heard from successful ranked choice voting candidates in other cities is that that makes them a better elected official, because they have a much clearer idea of what the concerns and issues are that are important to the majority of voters in the district. And therefore, they feel empowered. They also know that they are the consensus choice of a majority of the district, instead of being the choice of 24, 35, maybe 41 or 42% of the voters in their district. They build a coalition of support. And so when they are elected, they feel empowered to work for the issues that they talk to the voters about. And I think that at the end of the day, that is another one of the really salutary impacts which ranked choice voting has. Building that consensus majority around not just the person, but about the issues that they feel are important. And these are all things that we work with candidates and campaign staff to understand and to help them modify the way in which they campaign.
Thank you, Susan. I would like to move on to Rebecca. Rebecca, you ran for mayor in Oakland, California in 2010 and again in 2014, where the winner was determined by ranked choice voting. So you bring firsthand experience to this conversation. Please explain how your campaign strategies were influenced by the fact that the winner would be determined by ranked choice voting.
Yes, thank you for that. And it's really great to get to be a part of this conversation. I've approached ranked choice voting both as a policy advocate, as a candidate, and I am the council member at large in Oakland. And one thing I thought worth sharing is that I was elected to the city council before ranked choice voting, and I have been re-elected since it has been implemented. And so I have won the council seat both without ranked choice voting and with it. And I think that's important to share because sometimes people assume you're either for it or against it because of who you think will win under it. But actually part of why I started pushing for ranked choice voting in Oakland is to strengthen the participation in our democracy, that we were having our elections on a primary with a lower turnout in order to leave room for a general runoff, and moving it to a consolidated general election using ranked choice voting allowed us to consolidate our council election onto the higher turnout general elections when the president every 4 years or the governor on the alternating 4-year cycle would be also on the ballot. And so that moved it to a much higher participation election. And so some of the impact of that system, how we did it, was also having to reach out to a broader range of people in general, because we consolidated it onto a higher turnout election. So for cities that are looking at whether to do this or how, that could be something to look at. Some other, though, specifics about my experience, I found myself learning when I spoke to voters or spoke at events to say, you know, not only I'd like your vote, which by the way, as candidates, you should say that, you should ask for people's vote, but also to say, and if I'm not your first choice, if someone else is your first choice, I would be honored to also have your second choice vote. And to really say that and really mean that and connect with people around that, in terms of my own speaking, in terms of campaign materials, but also in that sort of famous ranked choice voting election in Oakland that happened that you showed on the screen. The person who thought he had won, the person who got the highest number of first place votes, really thought he had won. He ordered the champagne, he sent out the party announcements. Many saw it as a done deal because they assumed that he would get an equal proportionate share of the second place votes as he had of the first place votes. But during the campaign, he was really mean to people, and he was really rude to anyone who wasn't his core supporters. And so then as they continued to count votes and run the ranked choice, and then myself and the other candidates, as we were eliminated, those second choices did not go to the person who had been first on the number ones. And the person who ended up winning, Jean Kwan, was the candidate who had been the most humble in the sense of explicitly saying, I want your number two, I love Rebecca, or I love this other candidate, you know, we're great. You know, she did that more than anybody else and ended up winning. And the person who was the most sort of rude and took that old stance of, you know, you're either with me or you're against me, thought he won and ended up not winning.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to continue asking questions which any of the panelists can answer. The first one is, how have education efforts been affected by the pandemic, where you can't hold in-person meetings or public forums?
Well, we started our education of candidates in February of last year. And so we had an entire program built out around training people over a 6-hour in-person session with breakout rooms and facilitated discussions. And we had to go back to the drawing board and completely revise everything for an online training, which frankly has been more challenging because it's a lot easier to draw people out when we're asking them to do exercises, when we can put them in teams in person together and send them off to breakout rooms. But frankly, you know, we have been, I think we've been successful in that conversion. So we use Zoom, we use breakout rooms in Zoom. We have online public forums. And we've had public forums with as many as 250 and 300 people, members of the public, who have tuned in to learn about ranked choice voting and to hear what specific candidates or elected officials have to say about it. So it's challenging, but it can be done.
Amy, what do you have to say
And I
about
mean,
that?
and I would agree with Susan. I mean, I think that actually we've found that, you know, with our trainings, you know, with the public and, you know, doing them remotely has actually been great. I mean, we have, you know, we have done direct 24 reach 2,400 individual voters coming to sessions. You know, some of them, as Susan pointed out, some of our sessions have had 200 odd people, and you know, in-person sessions, you know, to get someone to come out on a, you know, to go to you know, the public library or whatever on a night, you know, there are a hardcore group of people who will do that, but you definitely, you know, we've been able to reach actually more people, you know, because it is, you know, they can do that from the convenience of their own home. And so while, yes, you know, being able to go to events, like if it was a normal year, and there was street fairs and you know, different community events going on, you know, we would have been there too, reaching people where they are. This way, it requires a little bit more of people coming to us, but I think it has been, you know, very successful. And you know, it's hard to judge. This is where we are. I mean, this is what we had to do, so it's, you know, it's impossible to really compare fully what would have happened if we had not been, you know, confined to indoors for a year. But I think that, you know, we've been able to reach people really effectively. And you know, in some of our public hearings, we've had more people coming to the you know, the online Zoom meeting over than we had coming in person. And so we were actually talking about, when we go back to working in the office, working out a way to do things by, you know, remotely too, because we've had such success with it.
Right. Thank you. Moving on to the next question. I believe few, if any, major minority organizations have come out in support of ranked choice voting in the upcoming primary election. How is your organization dealing with this in an effort to get minorities to turn out and vote?
So I would have to disagree with the premise of the question, because there are a limited number of relatively loud minority electeds and one organization that does not like ranked choice voting. It doesn't mean that there are other organizations that haven't endorsed it. So we have significant support in the African American community. We have significant support in the New American community, the New York Immigration Coalition, the Center for Law and Social Justice, a significant number of elected officials of color, starting with Jumaane Williams, all have endorsed ranked choice voting. But the impact of the vocal opponents is, I think, to unfortunately confuse people, to make ranked choice voting sound more complicated than it is. And so what we have done is to work closely with partners in the communities that are often overlooked and marginalized, and preparing materials in extensive numbers of languages. In fact, when I last checked, we were up to 12 languages that we provide trainings in and materials in. So it's working with partners. It's having organizers from diverse communities. And basically, I think the city council's adoption of the education bill, making it clear that whatever a particular leader or elected official thought about ranked choice voting in 2019, it's happening in June. And we all have a responsibility to educate the maximum number of voters. And what we are seeing is a lot more collaboration from elected officials and leaders in the diverse communities because they want their voters to be educated.
Amy, do you have something to add to that?
And I mean, I agree with Susan. I think that there's been more. It's unfortunate because I think sometimes things are self-fulfilling prophecies, and the more you tell people, oh, it's difficult and no one's trained you, the more people are like, oh, I don't want to find out about it. But again, we've worked with a lot of community partners, and like Susan has said, and there's certainly a lot of partners in the minority communities that are doing this, and even I attended just personally a Facebook Live event held by a council member who I know absolutely, was a vocal opponent of ranked choice voting. But I think that people realize, that there's a responsibility, and he gave over his weekly Facebook session to a training about ranked choice voting. So I think people are. I think that people are being trained, and I think we do have an obligation and opportunity to train people and explain to them, I think Peter explained it very well. It is not as complicated as people think. When you first hear about it, it sounds complicated, but I think when it comes right down as far as the voters, how you think about, there's simple things to think about when you're ranking people. It's a simple process to actually mark the ballot. I think that tabulation may be a complicated topic, but I don't know that necessarily every single voter needs to understand 100% how the votes are tabulated. Most people don't really understand how you go and vote, how those voting machines work either. So I think I think that focusing on what people need to know and how to do it, and make sure that they have an understanding of why they want to do it and why they want to make it best use of the amount of ranks that they can have, is part of the whole process of explaining to people and educating them.
Thank you. One just last question on voter education. I guess how prepared do you think voters will be by the June elections in terms of getting out and voting and understanding that it's to their advantage not just to vote for their favorite, but to use more than one ranking, maybe all 5 rankings. How prepared do you think the voters will be by the June elections?
Well,
I must say that I was
very prepared, and I mean, and again, as voter turnout in municipal elections is not great. That's a truism, across the years. I think people will be educated. I do think there'll be some people who are not, who have missed the information. I mean, we're going to do a robust paid advertising campaign as required by that city council law. We're already planning it for the spring, on television and newspapers and radio. So, people will hopefully have heard of it, even if they don't fully understand. We will be doing this postcard, so they will know that it is coming. And I think that people will be prepared. Is it 100%? I don't know, but I mean, I don't think I'm aiming for 100%, but we are aiming that people will understand that it's there and that they're voting in a different way. And it's exciting. This is an exciting opportunity for New York City.
Yeah.
Susan?
And what we've seen actually is I think, look, New York City is pretty good in terms of providing the voter guide. But even so, there's a relative paucity of information. As a result of ranked choice voting, voters are getting much more information about the process of voting. There's the Campaign Finance Board will be sending out a postcard in addition to what's in the voter guide. The Board of Elections is sending out additional material. Groups like Rank the Vote NYC are sending out additional mailings. And there's a huge amount of information actually in the polling place as well, that shows voters how to fill out the ballot. And at least the anecdotal experience we had in talking to voters on election day in CD 31, when we asked them, how was it? Was this complicated? What did you think? And the answers we were getting, obviously not a scientific sampling, was, hey, it was simple. That ballot was clear. No, I was in and out, no problem. So, I think our experience here will be similar to the experience in the other cities that have it, where the exit polling will show that the vast majority of people understood it, were able to vote with it, and liked it.
And just turning to candidates, we talked about educating candidates, but again, how prepared will candidates be in using the ranked choice voting format for this election? Is it just logical that some candidates will really be prepared and take advantage of it, and some will miss that opportunity?
And some will deliberately refuse. When you're talking about more than 400 people running for office, you're going to have a bell curve distribution of how they deal with ranked choice voting. It's just human nature. But I know that the campaign finance board, Rebecca is nodding yes. Some people just don't get it, no matter what you do. And they're stubborn, and they think that they can run the campaign the way they have in the past. And maybe some will be able to do that, but the vast majority will not.
Rebecca,
so we're doing everything we can. We have been in touch with every candidate to offer them detailed trainings, and a really significant number have taken advantage of our offer, which is free training, including the major mayoral candidates as well.
And
Rebecca, what is your, Amy, just make a comment, then I'd like to ask Rebecca what she experienced.
And I just wanted to add to Susan, I mean, obviously one thing that we have in New York City is our public matching funds program, which is part of the driving force of the close to 500 candidates now. And so we have also prepared training materials and guidance documents for people in the public financing program to understand how that works with ranked choice voting and what they can do and can't do. And, and so that there's no fear that, if I endorse another candidate, I'm somehow going to jeopardize my matching funds, and making that clear to everyone. So we've published that guidance for all the candidates.
Thank you. Rebecca, what did you actually experience in your elections? We know the strategies, but not everybody would adopt them. What did you find?
Absolutely. So yes, it is different as a candidate. It does have the potential to encourage more coalition building if you're a candidate who is willing to have that attitude and adopt that. And, myself and Jean Kwan started a bit of a step in that direction. But since that, in subsequent cycles, subsequent candidates have taken that even further. And I don't know whether or not you're able to show the video, but my former chief of staff, Sheng Tao, also the first Hmong American woman elected official in California, ran for city council, ran an explicitly ranked choice voting strategy with a TV ad of 3 women candidates explicitly saying nice things about each other and encouraging people to include all 3 of them, 1, 2, 3, on their ballot. And so over time, as people have gained experience with this, I think the level of candidates putting explicitly the ranking in their materials will continue to increase, but only among candidates who have the wisdom to be able to do that, and the ability to not have it just be so much about their own ego that they could talk nicely about someone else. And then the last thing I thought worth mentioning is that another source of information is the organizations that do endorsements. So you've got all these political clubs that endorse candidates. And one of the things that took a couple election cycles to catch on for us, and if any of you are part of these organizations or know them in New York, you may want to pitch them on this. Some of the organizations that did endorsements did not immediately catch on to doing ranked choice endorsements and change their endorsement process to achieve that. And that over various election cycles has started to catch on, so that if you're a member of a political club that endorses candidates, you'll get a mailer saying, our club endorses the following 1, 2, 3, or in your case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that can really help because people have various organizations they trust. And when they get it from those groups clearly laid out in order, like they'll see to go vote on the ballot, that can also build greater both understanding of and utilization of those rankings.
Thank you. We're running a little over. I don't know if I can take another 5 or minutes or so. I will assume I can do that.
Herb, this is Peter. I just want to say one thing. If people haven't looked at the poll, go back and look at the poll because it's very interesting.
Where will they find the poll?
They'll find the poll when they voted already. So if they click back on
It
Chat.
says see the results or something.
the link,
You vote on the ballot. It takes you to a new screen, and there's a red words that say something like see preliminary results. So you
Right.
click on that, and it takes you to the rounds.
Okay. Let me just ask a question about money in politics. It was said that there was an example that Rebecca gave, or Peter actually gave in his presentation, that a candidate in the 2010 election in Oakland, there was one candidate who spent a lot of money on negative ads, and it seemed to backfire. Rebecca, can you comment on why it didn't work and why negative advertising doesn't work in ranked choice voting elections?
Sure thing. Let's see. Oh, I should turn on my camera. Hi there. Yes, so part of why the big negative spending doesn't work is unless you're going to assume you're going to clear 50% on the first round, you're going to need people who didn't put you number one to put you number two in order to win. And so traditionally, negative advertising raises the negatives, both of the person attacked and of the person doing attacking. If you look at the data on the impact of negative ads, it sometimes will lower the acclaim of the person you attack, but it will simultaneously lower how people feel about the person doing the attacking. And so since you need to get those second choice votes, someone who does that attacking of other people is going to be much less likely to do them. One brief word of warning is that unfortunately, some people have dealt with that by setting up fake attack packs that use a different name. So you used to have like committee supporting, John Doe. And so now they're starting to play games with like, oh, committee for mom and apple pie to run the attack ads in the hopes that people won't realize who was behind the attacks. So we're continuing to work on disclosure requirements around those things. But yes, it does tend, ranked choice voting does tend to not reward candidates who go negative.
Susan, did
we
you have
won't
something to
worry
say?
about that in New York City.
Right, because we have the top 3 disclosure requirement.
So, we have, very robust independent spending disclosure that my agency administers. And so and one of the things is that on the actual mailer, you actually have to say who the top 3 contributors are to your ad campaign. Plus, you can see that, you can take that ad and go to our website and see all the contributors. And there's, drilling down from organizations. So you can't even have, Mom for Apple Pie is the spender, and then, Mom for Apple Pie and Puppies is the contributor. It's like you have to drill down to get to at a point, someplace actual living human being. Not in every single case, but it's like 3 tiers. So hopefully there, in most cases, you'll actually see who is behind the spending.
Okay, I had a few more questions, but we've gone over time in this panel discussion. So I would like to turn it over to Mike Otten, who will continue the program with questions and answers of the panelists. Take it away, Mike.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. One of the questions is about the New York City Board of Elections in terms of their readiness to implement the technology to make ranked choice voting easy to tabulate. So that's one maybe for Amy or Susan.
I'll let Susan comment.
I was going to say Amy's probably going to let me comment. We've been working really closely with the New York City Board. I think the New York City Board has actually taken a big jump in 2020 in terms of what they've been able to handle. They're working with outside experts on ranked choice voting. They're not doing this alone. The provider of the software tabulator is a recognized expert on ranked choice voting elections, and they've been retained to advise them on how best to report. And I think in a unexpected consequence of having so many special elections earlier on in the year, is that it is giving the Board of Elections experience with ranked choice voting. They've made some modifications to the signage, to how they're describing ranked choice voting on the materials that are available at the polls as they are experiencing feedback from voters. So I'm fairly confident, and I'm pretty confident actually, that by the time we get to June, they will have evolved the best procedures that work here in New York City.
But I will, point out, and I think I completely agree with what Susan had said. One thing people need to remember though, and I think that Peter put it in his presentation, that it will take longer to, may take longer to find out the winner, than the election night. And that's, we've hopefully all, learned that this is, it takes time to tabulate absentee ballots, to do the rounds. It will be a slightly longer process.
Well, but as it is in any close election, because of the significant gap between election day and when state law allows the absentee ballots to be canvassed and counted, the tabulation for ranked choice voting, once the software is approved by the state, is literally less than 30 seconds. So ranked choice voting in and of itself doesn't increase or decrease the time that it takes us to get the results in a close election. But so for CD24, where they did not need to go 2 rounds, it was pretty obvious on election night that we probably weren't going to have to go to rounds. So in that way, I don't think ranked choice voting by itself makes that much of a difference on the gap.
Yes, and I think you're right. I think that if it's, if there's, I think it depends how close the elections are.
Can I ask this question? In what's it, CD31, that was the other election?
Mm-hmm.
In CD31, do they have any results yet?
No,
So
no, because the absentee ballots have not yet been counted.
But the point I was trying to make, so I apologize if I made it seem incorrect, is in a plurality election, you would get some partial numbers. You would start to see some counting of partial numbers. And in the
No, not in New York City. They do not release the absentee counts until they've completed them all, which is what was making people crazy.
In 14 in the primary, in the 2020 Democratic primary.
That's correct. They waited until they had the certified results. Now, some of the candidates who were there for the count were seeing what was happening, and they were leaking to the press. Right. The board was mum.
No.
And we can debate, and we're actually having a discussion with them about when is the right time to release results. Would it be confusing to release? We at Common Cause believe it would be confusing to release incomplete results, but there are some people who advocate for that. So I
agree with you completely. And my point was, it's like, we don't need instant gratification. The world won't come to an end if the people in Queens have to wait an extra week to see who won District 31. And that was my point. Wasn't that my point? Wasn't that the counting is going to take longer? My point is that with people you weren't going to have instant gratification because people weren't going to be releasing all these secret numbers.
But at the end, after the counting and the rounds are completed, everything will be released.
Yeah.
And what we're working with them on is that they release more than numbers, that they do a graphic presentation similar to what you see in the mock election that you just did for movies, which I think is easier for voters to visualize how it works. But we're not there yet. We're still working on it.
There are 2 or 3 questions that kind of relate to the relationship between primaries and final election. And I guess all the talk this afternoon and this evening is about the Democratic primary. What about the Republicans? What about the final election? What are the relationships between step 1 and step 2 going to November?
Well, I mean, in New York City, I mean, the ranked choice voting only applies to primaries, but it applies to all primaries. So, so if there's maybe a Republican primary for mayor, so it will apply in that primary too. And in special elections, which are nonpartisan, it applied, across the board for nonpartisan elections. In the past, when we had runoff elections, you would have the two people, if no one got more than 40% of the vote, they would have the runoff. And, those elections were, the drop off in vote turnout was enormous. And, so this is, very similar. It's correcting, for not having to have runoffs. And then the person who wins the primary will move to the general election. As it would have been in the past, if there was no runoff, or if there was a runoff, that the one person who won the Democratic primary, the one person who won the Republican primary would move to the general election, plus, other people who are on the ballot on independent party lines.
Yeah, so any time for a primary or special election, you have more than two candidates from whatever party primary it is, then you have ranked choice voting. Now, there was extensive discussion in the Charter Revision Commission in 2019, the Charter Revision Commission that put ranked choice voting and other election reforms on the ballot for the voters to approve or disapprove, about whether it should be for the primary and specials and the general, or simply for the primary and specials. And they decided, because we have fusion voting in New York, where you could have the same candidate on the ballot in 2 or 3 different places, that for the introduction of ranked choice, and that's in the general, right? So for the introduction of ranked choice voting, let's start with a primary and special, where the candidate only appears once, and we don't have to worry that the voter will get confused by the candidate being on different party lines and vote for them 2 or 3 times and disempower their vote. I fully expect that once people are used to ranked choice voting, that there will be a discussion and very likely the adoption of ranked choice voting for the general once the voters are used to it.
There's also a question that talks about the fact that it's the individual parties are kind of running on their own track, and it doesn't really get necessarily the moderates included. I'm tempted to read the entire statement because it's fairly detailed and it makes sense. It says that if the 2/3 of the voters might elect a moderate Democrat, while the GOP's 12% of the New York City voters might choose a moderate Republican, general election voters are left to choose between the 34 and the 93, not really the middle of the road finalists. They might be ending up looking at the extreme left and right more than the middle. And then they refer to the California top 2 approach with the nonpartisan primary and the top 2 be going to the final. And then, of course, the longer term approach of Alaska that also is supported by Gale and Porter, which goes to a final 5 in a final election. Are you looking at these things as also possible evolution in the New York City environment?
I think anything is possible in evolving our elections. It depends on, what people propose and build a consensus around. But I would like to point out that the winner of a ranked choice voting election is the winner who builds a consensus. And in some instances, that is a more moderate candidate who appeals to a larger number of voters. And in other instances, it may be a candidate who has a particularly strong position on an important issue that appeals in their district. So I don't feel that we can comfortably say, oh, you always get moderates through ranked choice voting, or you only get, ideological extremes. You get a mix of everything as far as we can tell from other jurisdictions.
And I think one thing that's important to note, and I think that Peter mentioned it in his presentation, is that, one of the advantage, and I think Rebecca mentioned it, is that one of the advantages of this is it encourages candidates to reach out to a range of voters. And so, you don't just go to what the experts call your prime voters, the people that are your A vote. You're incentivized to speak to a lot of people, and that's better for voters because your voice has more opportunity to be heard because more candidates will be soliciting your input and listening to your opinions. So I mean, I think that it's important that whether, depending on not just who wins, but whether they're listening to the voters, because they're going to have to run in the next election too. And, if you won, and if you only listen to the, one type of voter, even if you win, you still in the next election are going to have to listen to a range of voters because you're still going to have to run in a ranked choice election.
That kind of leads to one of the other questions, which is whether or not the arrangements between candidates when they collaborate, as was the case in the video that we didn't get to show, isn't that a little bit like a type of political club and influencing instead of just individual candidates running against each other?
If the question is this a way in which a political party can force affiliations? That's actually not what we're seeing here in New York City. What we're seeing, at least in the special elections, is that the party favorite stands by themselves and the other candidates are making affiliations. And it's actually the more progressive, the challengers who don't have a party apparatus behind them, who have the most incentive to find a collaborating opponent to increase their visibility.
I think for a final question, because we are creeping up on the end of the scheduled time, is really just a general one about the drawbacks of ranked choice voting. Peter addressed some of those in his presentation, but would anyone like to comment on some of the other potential areas where ranked choice voting may be subject to attack either during or after the election?
I don't really have a comment on that.
I mean, I think that I think Peter pointed out what the issues are. I mean, I do think that, in winner take all elections, people make choices too. I mean, you may favor a candidate that you think doesn't have a chance to win. I mean, you hear that from people all the time. Oh, I voted for that person because I thought my favorite candidate had no chance to win. And this really gives you an opportunity to vote your actual preference because, even, so you think, okay, I'm going to vote this person. I don't think they're going to win, but I'll vote them one. And, I'll put a person who is, more likely to win, that, and maybe as my 2 or 3 person. So I think it definitely gives people, I think one thing that will be a shame is if people don't take advantage of that. And I think that is, one possibility. So hopefully when we see the results, we will see that people are actually taking advantage of the rankings. And other jurisdictions have seen that, substantially, that when they introduce this, people do take advantage of that.
Because what we tell voters and candidates is that your number one choice should be the choice that you're really passionate about, because you have backups. Your 2, 3, 4, and 5th choices are backups that only come into play if your first choice or your earlier choices are eliminated, which gives your vote just much more power than in the plurality system, where if you vote, you have one vote, and if you pick somebody who you think would be fabulous, but they don't have a strong base of support, have you wasted your vote? Your vote has been exhausted. It doesn't have any place else to go on the plurality race, where in ranked choice voting, you have your backups, but they only come into play if your first choice or your early choices aren't winners.
Well, I want to thank all of the panelists and certainly the audience as well for sticking with us on what is a complex innovation, not an innovation maybe, but approach to elections that I think is going to make the results of in government better than ever before. Barry or Herb, do you have any other comments you'd want to make in conclusion?
I would just like to ask if somebody wanted to see Peter's presentation, how does that happen? Get a copy.
We're going to post it on the website within the next day or two, most likely tomorrow.
Do we have our website available for the viewers?
That would be reformelectionsnow.org.
Thank you.
I can also do a follow-up with all of the attendees from tonight, and I can share the video once you guys have had a chance to determine what you want to permit and whatnot, and any follow-up material that you would like.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you
Okay,
for.
and I think the questions were answered about being able to look at the poll was basically sign back in and then you can see the results. There was.
By the way, you don't have to use your real name or an email. It's just a way to get in. So you can be anything you want, and it'll get you back into the poll. It's not captured in any way.
If you vote twice, you have to use a different email address for the second vote.
Or a different, you don't even have to have an email. Just put anything in that space.
Okay.
I mean, you can call yourself Yoda at gmail.com and vote for Star Wars, or
There have been some write-in votes like that already in the official elections.
Yeah. Incidentally, my favorite, just I'll let everybody run, but there's a candidate who runs every year in Minneapolis and gets a decent number of votes, Captain Jack Sparrow. And I mean, no, you can look it up. I'm not making this up. And Captain Jack Sparrow, he gets 500 to 1,000 votes in every election. He's run in every election. And but then his supporters then vote for somebody else in later rounds.
I think we'd like to thank Peter and Susan and Amy and Rebecca for this wonderful program.
I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to have such a thoughtful discussion.
And thank you. And again, I mean, we have lots of resources on our website. So I put it in the answer to someone's question, but I'll say it now. It's nyccfb.info/RCV. So if you can see illustrations of ballots and how the tabulation works, and frequently asked questions about ranked choice voting there.
And if you're looking for information in Bangla, Russian, 2 forms of Chinese, Nepali, Spanish, rankthevote.nyc.org.
Thank you.
Okay.
I propose that we leave the session open for a little bit longer. People can certainly leave, but we can try to just check and make sure if we haven't answered some of the questions live, we can try to answer them in the Q&A section of the list. And I'll also put the website for reformelectionsnow.org in the chat area.
One question, if we're officially ended, one question that I would like to ask Susan and Amy is this: there's so many candidates running, not only for mayor, but for controller and public advocate, and city council and borough president. I guess there's a responsibility on the part of the voters to become educated on all of the people who are running, and I guess there's a responsibility on the candidates to get the word out. But in order to rank the candidates, you have to know something about them. So it's more work.
Well, in a sense, I'm not sure that even I am going to become really expert on all 30 plus candidates running for mayor. But what we have found is that, one, the candidates do work harder to communicate with a larger number of voters. And in most instances, what we've heard back in other jurisdictions is the voters like having candidates provide more information and reach out to a broader selection of the electorate. So it improves the election process, I think, by providing more information.
Yeah, and I mean, and of course, as always, in every election, we will be mailing to everyone who's registered the voter guide that has, statements and profiles of the candidates, plus, online guide that has slightly more information, and plus the videos that candidates film. So if you want to get to know, about the candidates, you can use that information that's provided, in a nonpartisan manner across to all registered voters.
Okay, once again, thank you for coming. And I hope that you, all of you who live in New York City and are registered voters will vote in both the primaries and the final election.
Yes.
And
Please.
we'll see if the government improves next year.
Liz, can you shut?
Yes,
the
are you
program
ready?
down? Yes.
Okay. Thank you all for being with us. Our
Thank you.
session will now end.
Hey,
Take care,
everybody.
everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, have a nice evening and a good week.
Okay.